This lesson is entitled Ways to Prove that Quadrilaterals are Parallelograms. This is section 5-2 in your textbook. The essential question for this lesson is, what are 5 ways to prove that a quadrilateral is a parallelogram? Well, we already know one way to prove that a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, and that is to use the definition. Okay, so the definition simply states that if both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, then the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So the first way to prove it is to use the definition. Now, there's 4 additional ways, and they're listed as theorems in this section. The first theorem is Theorem 5-4. This theorem states, if both pairs of opposite sides of a quadrilateral are congruent, then the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So if you've got a quadrilateral with opposite sides congruent, then you happen to have a parallelogram. So this is another way of proving that a quadrilateral is a parallelogram. The next theorem is Theorem 5-5. Now this one's a little bit harder to understand, but listen carefully. It states, if one pair of opposite sides of a quadrilateral are both congruent and parallel, then the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So here's a case where we're talking only about one pair of opposite sides. We don't care about the other pair of opposite sides. We're just saying if one pair of opposite sides is both congruent and parallel, then the quadrilateral has to be a parallelogram. Theorem 5-5. The next theorem is Theorem 5-6. This theorem states, if both pairs of opposite angles of a quadrilateral are congruent, then the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So this doesn't deal with sides at all, it simply deals with opposite angles. So if opposite angles are congruent, then you've got a quadrilateral, provided both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. Now the last theorem is Theorem 5-7, and again, this doesn't deal with the sides. This now deals with the diagonals, and it says, if the diagonals of a quadrilateral bisect each other, then the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So now, as you can see, we have 5 ways to prove that a 4-sided figure or a quadrilateral is a parallelogram. The first is to use the definition that show that both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. The second, show that both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. The third, show that one pair of opposite sides are both congruent and parallel. The fourth, show that both pairs of opposite angles are congruent. And then the fifth and last is show that the diagonals bisect each other. So if you can show any of these, you can prove that the figure you're dealing with is a parallelogram. All right, I would like you now to complete with always, sometimes, or never, and post your answers in the drop box. So number 1, the diagonals of a quadrilateral always, sometimes, or never bisect each other. 2, if the measures of 2 angles of a quadrilateral are equal, then the quadrilateral is always, sometimes, or never a parallelogram. 3, if one pair of opposite sides of a quadrilateral is congruent and parallel, then the quadrilateral is always, sometimes, or never a parallelogram. 4, if both pairs of opposite sides of a quadrilateral are congruent, then the quadrilateral is always, sometimes, or never a parallelogram. And then the last is 5, to prove a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, it is enough to show that one pair of opposite sides is a parallelogram. So figure out what the answers are for each of these and post them in the drop box. Thank you.